Hello dear friends, you are on Ruslan Belov's channel and this is the daily analysis of the Ukrainian front. So friends, a huge success occurred for the Russian army over the past 24 hours. While we are all watching and closely observing Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and say the Dobropolye sector, the first tank army of Russia has taken almost half of another city. Of course, I am talking about Kupiansk. Look at what is happening here. What is happening is nothing less than the total flight of the armed forces of Ukraine. Because when you lose in a single day, and some sources even say in just a few hours, more than 10 square kilometers of urban area, including part of the industrial zone, this is nothing else but a total rout. Well, let us figure this out step by step. What exactly happened here? Let's start with the right bank part of the city, because without the advance on the right bank, there would not have been this 3-kilometer breakthrough on the left bank side of the city. I will explain why a little later. So what do we see on the map? First, importantly, a residential micro-district with multi-story buildings was taken. We already spoke several episodes ago that if these blocks were captured, it would facilitate the takeover of the adjacent private sector. Well, that is exactly what happened. The residential micro-district was taken, and then, as you see, the armed forces of Ukraine lost Gogol Street, Pushkinskaya Street, Korolenko Street. In addition, Russian troops managed to seize the building complex of the central city hospital, which the Ukrainian garrison had also turned into a fortified area, but they could not hold it or gain a foothold there. They also took the private sector southwest of the multi-story residential district, Severnaya Street, Tolstogo Street, and part of Sadovaya Street. Some of it is still controlled by the armed forces of Ukraine. In this area, fighting is now taking place on the approaches to Kupiansk Yuzhny railway station. Returning to the map, as you can see, a significant part of the western city territory has come under Russian control. From the direction of Moskovka, Russian forces advanced almost 1.5 kilometers through the private sector and took control of the railway station. More than 100 private houses were captured. From Sobolevka, Russian troops advanced 1 kilometer and 750 meters, entered Kupiansk, and also advanced through the private sector. In general, speaking about the right bank side of the city, only one multi-story micro-district remains, the Yubileyny district. Here it is located. It has 19 multi-story apartment buildings, which makes it roughly the same size as the micro-district already captured by the Russian army here. Apart from that, only the private sector remains on the right bank. Therefore, the advance here should accelerate. At least let me note, if the situation shown on this map corresponds to reality. Meanwhile, the situation for the armed forces of Ukraine is no better on the opposite bank, where they have started losing powerful fortifications and retreating toward Kupiansk-Uzlovy. By the way, if we discuss the prospects of further advancement on the right bank, it is necessary to straighten the front line in this way, taking control of Kupiansk Yuzhny station. Then only a small part of the right bank will remain. One micro-district of high-rise buildings and some private houses. The main question is how sustainable Russian control really is here, and how well protected they are from counterattacks. Now let us move to the left bank side of the city. The left bank mainly consists of factories and warehouses, plus private houses. So in fact, this advance of 3 kilometers and 300 meters through the urban area did not surprise me. Let me explain why, and I will show you visually. Switching to the relief map, here is Kupiansk. See how much higher the right bank is compared to the left bank. Accordingly, once you lose the right bank, it is simply impossible to hold positions on the left bank because you will constantly be fired upon from above and all your movements will be clearly visible. By the way, as some may remember, Russian troops already tried to start the assault on Kupiansk from the left bank almost a year ago, in the autumn of last year. They entered the city back then. Naturally, nothing came out of it for the Russian troops because they did not control the right bank, they were on the lower left bank, and the armed forces of Ukraine constantly shelled them with artillery and drones. So they had to retreat. Now the armed forces of Ukraine find themselves in exactly the same situation. They are pulling back because Russian troops already control most of the right bank, returning to the frontline map. What exactly do we have here? The advance in depth was 3 kilometers and 300 meters. The sugar factory district was taken, including the factory itself. Here is how it looks: a strong defensive hub. They also captured the dairy canning plant and some private housing. In addition, the streets around the sugar factory, which also include high-rise buildings. Ultimately, Russian troops reached as far as Nekrasov Street. Fighting is now taking place on the approaches to the main thoroughfare, Svatovskaya Street, as well as on the approaches to the Zaoskolie railway station. Looking ahead, the key here is to take this entire industrial zone, another powerful defensive hub. Beyond that, only private housing remains. If storming this zone head-on proves too difficult, then naturally the alternative is to bypass it through Kucherovka. Summing up the interim results of the battle for Kupiansk, the Russian army currently controls about 40% of the city. For perspective, just a week ago they controlled only a couple of streets, less than 1% of the city, and now in 1 week they hold 40%. The progress is simply gigantic. Over the past 24 hours, well, conditionally speaking, over the past 24 hours, more than 13 square kilometers were taken under control, mainly residential urban development. Recently I told you there was a chance to take the city by the end of the year. I do not want to radiate too much optimism right now, since this is the front and the situation can change. The armed forces of Ukraine might send reinforcements, launch counterattacks, and so on. But for now, it seems that the Russian army has managed to achieve a key turning point in the battle for Kupiansk, and the city will not be held by the armed forces of Ukraine. Still, let's be cautious and not celebrate prematurely. In summary, the chances of taking Kupiansk by the end of the year have greatly increased. Now let us turn to other advances. Apart from Kupiansk, over the past 24 hours, Russian forces advanced in another city, in the Mirnograd area. The advance was on the eastern flank. They moved forward more than 2 kilometers and reached the outskirts of the village of Balagan. This is a small settlement located near the Molodezhny micro-district in Mirnograd. Now Russian forces have about 900 meters left to reach the village. I will not make predictions here, since the situation, despite the progress, remains rather complicated, especially further north near Vladimirovka and Mayak. So we watch. Summing up the past 24 hours overall, about 16.5 square kilometers have come under Russian control. This has been a stable average rate of advance since May. More than 20 drones attacked the Trypilia thermal power plant, the largest generating hub in central Ukraine, which supplies Kyiv and 3 neighboring regions. 2 power units have reportedly been completely disabled, and other critical equipment was damaged. Another strike on the energy infrastructure took place in Chernihiv region, in Novgorod-Seversky. A substation was heavily damaged, cutting off electricity in 19 settlements. There were also explosions in Odessa region, but no details yet on the targets or results. The armed forces of Ukraine heavily shelled Donetsk and Makiivka. The strikes were chaotic. Hungary's worsening relations with Ukraine are Kyiv's fault, said Peter Zijato. The Hungarian foreign minister stated that it was Ukraine that stripped the Hungarian minority in the Carpathian region of their rights. Relations can only improve if those rights are fully restored. If an anti-corruption law could be reinstated overnight under pressure from Europe, then minority rights can be returned just as quickly, Zijato emphasized. The minister added that the European Union was more concerned with the fate of Ukraine's corrupt institutions than with the fate of Hungarians in Transcarpathia. He also expressed concern about the situation in France and Germany, where, according to him, patriotic forces continue to face political, legal, and even physical pressure. This winter, the entire Ukrainian energy system may collapse. The so-called Black Winter, long predicted, may come, reports the Telegram channel Legitimny. Power outages will last 15-20 hours daily. The reason is simple. This is retaliation for Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries and the Druzhba oil pipeline. At night, there were strikes on the Trypilia TPP near Kyiv. There were also massive strikes on energy facilities in Sumy region. After them, power supply problems began in Kyiv region, parts of the capital and parts of Sumy region. Stock up in advance. Zelensky is deliberately provoking. He needs a tragedy he can use for personal PR to demand more money for continuing the confrontation. The office also hopes this will push more people into military enlistment offices, so Bankova Street can drive everyone to the front and keep ruling. But this no longer works. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that no sanctions will ever force Russia to change its consistent position. Let me remind you, a European Union delegation's visit to Washington was announced to discuss new coordinated sanctions against Russia with the United States. European countries must stop buying Russian oil and gas if they want Washington to tighten sanctions against Moscow, said U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, as reported by Financial Times. Wright urged European states to switch to American liquefied natural gas and other fuels under the recently concluded trade deal. The EU is obligated to buy energy resources from the US worth $750 billion by the end of 2028. The United States is simply blackmailing the European Union and looking for an excuse not to impose sanctions on Russia. And there is a chance that the EU will stop buying LNG, but the US will not impose sanctions anyway. America is putting Europe in a tough fork. These moves are extremely damaging for the EU economy. In the end, Donald gets a win-win situation. If the EU refuses, Trump gains an argument why he does not quarrel with Putin over sanctions. If the EU agrees, its economy takes a bullet to the head, industry flees to the US, and Europe continues to buy energy from America at inflated prices, hundreds of billions a year. And that is only after a painful compromise with Trump's allies, Fico and Orban, or after a final conflict with them. They need oil. It is not about drug trafficking. No, they need oil and gas. With these words, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro described the real goals of the US, which is concentrating its forces off the Venezuelan coast. Will Trump dare to launch a military operation against Venezuela? How might it look, and what consequences would it have? US President Donald Trump has renamed the Department of Defense into the War Ministry. And apparently, the first war under its new name is not far away. The United States is concentrating its warships near Venezuela, while President Maduro, in response, is mobilizing militias and gathering the army, deploying it along the coast and near borders with neighboring states. This is not the first attempt by the US to remove a regime unfriendly to it in Venezuela, but perhaps the most serious one, and not only because US President Donald Trump is extremely determined. So the United States now has all the legal grounds for an invasion, and by legal here, it does not mean international law, but rather domestic American law. The President of the United States has full authority to start a war against another country and wage it for 2 months without the approval of Congress. Washington has already declared war on drug cartels, and the Pentagon has been instructed to attack cartel forces anywhere in the world, including on the territory of third countries. At the same time, the White House officially claims that the president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, is simultaneously the leader of the Los Soles cartel, which is allegedly responsible for nearly 20% of all South American cocaine entering the American market, and a reward of $50 million has been placed on his capture. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio openly calls Nicolás Maduro a drug trafficker and a terrorist, insisting that he does not care about the opinion of international institutions. The United Nations does not agree, but I do not care what they say. He is hiding from American justice. He is not the legitimate leader of Venezuela, says the head of the State Department. Therefore, an invasion of Venezuela could well be framed as an anti-narcotics operation. Of course, this looks like hypocrisy and a cover for the real objectives of the United States. They need oil. It is not about drug trafficking. No, they need oil and gas, says Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro on this matter. And indeed, Venezuela possesses some of the world's largest hydrocarbon reserves, and the rights to extract these resources could be transferred to BRICS countries. And it is precisely with BRICS that the White House administration has been most actively fighting on the international stage in recent times. From a purely military standpoint, the United States undoubtedly has overwhelming superiority over Venezuela. The total strength of the Venezuelan armed forces is up to 150,000 personnel, of which up to 100,000 are ground troops. They have a small number of modern weapons, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and aviation equipment of Russian manufacture. Small but effective S-300 air defense complexes, explains Andrei Klintsevich. According to him, Venezuela has prepared a decent regional army to counter an adversary within its continent. But this is absolutely insufficient to resist the United States, which possesses the strongest army in the Western Hemisphere. The strategic advantage is also on the side of the United States, if only because as the attacking side, they are able to choose any strategy they deem necessary. Most likely, we are talking about pinpoint strikes with cruise missiles. The destroyers and submarines assembled in the region can launch a strike volley of around 1-200 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Such a volley can break through any air defense system, believes Andrei Klintsevich. After this, Washington could clear Venezuelan skies and then deploy ground forces. In particular, right now the U.S. Army is conducting exercises in neighboring Puerto Rico to practice landing operations, including the deployment of infantry from the sea to land. Although it is unlikely that the Pentagon is planning a full-scale occupation of Venezuela, if only because in the jungles the Venezuelans are capable of waging a serious guerrilla war, negating all potential benefits from seizing Venezuelan oil fields. Judging by what the Americans are preparing, they are not planning any large-scale ground operation. The 5,000-strong contingent of U.S. Marines currently training in Puerto Rico is geared toward evacuation tasks, or perhaps a physical capture of Maduro. Land, seize the target, and withdraw, says Andrei Klintsevich. The internal political situation in Venezuela also favors such actions. Yes, Nicolás Maduro assures that there will be an organized struggle of the entire people in case of aggression. But if it comes down to land, capture, and withdraw, then the entire population will not pour into the streets. After all, Nicolás Maduro's positions in the country can hardly be considered solid. In the 2024 elections, he received only 52% of the votes, and it can be confidently stated that around 40% of the population, mostly the middle class, are opposed to him. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado has already accused Maduro of arming militias because of his distrust of the army. She hinted that the president himself is to blame for the current situation, because he makes decisions in favor of foreign countries, Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran. Therefore, the United States may find many people in Venezuela sympathetic to its goals, provided, of course, that the goal is the overthrow of Maduro and not the occupation of the country. In this case, opposition representatives, some of whom already hold positions as mayors and even governors of certain provinces, would seize power. They could then sign over to the Americans all the oil fields that Washington desires. At the moment, only one thing is missing for a limited invasion: a political decision by Trump. The President of the United States understands that even in the case of a successful operation, its consequences will be unpredictable. Any war is fraught with surprises, including unpleasant ones. Yes, successful strikes on economic targets and even the capture of Nicolás Maduro could become a serious signal to the countries of the Western Hemisphere, breaking their will to cooperate with China and forcing them to respect America's wishes. But on the other hand, this could provoke a powerful surge of anti-American sentiment in a region that has always hated America, and this would bury all hopes of regaining ideological and economic control over its backyard. There must be no servile submission to foreigners in Panama, nor in Ecuador, nor in Colombia, nor in Venezuela, says Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, which until recently was considered a key U.S. ally in South America. Therefore, Trump must decide whether he is ready to take the risk, to throw the political dice in hopes of a favorable outcome.